Hello and welcome to the Thai Demon Beta podcast, where today we're talking about the current state of data retention. Now, 2015 looks to be a year wherein the Parliament of Australia begins to think about how far behind the eight ball it is and where its members try and bring the law of Australia up to date a bit. It seems their first step towards this will be to introduce a new regime of retaining the population's communications data. But before we delve into what data is going to be stored and who's going to be storing it and what it'll be used for, we'll take a look at the situation now and see what sparked the sudden interest in changing the laws regarding data retention. Currently, there is no specific information that is required to be recorded by a carrier or content service provider, or CCSP. And the term CCSP can include telephone carrier providers, internet service providers, and many online content providers such as Microsoft and potentially services such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. They record what information is required for them to go about their business, and there are no requirements for them to destroy information or regulations regarding what they can store or retain. Whatever is retained by the CCSPs is split into two groups, depending on whether the data contains the content or substance of communications. The first group is called stored telecommunications information, and this includes information such as the content of a phone call or an email, a post on Facebook, a tweet, an SMS, or even an instant message. And this information requires a warrant to obtain. The second group of data is referred to as telecommunications data. These terms, as you can tell, aren't very distinctive or descriptive of exactly what data is being referred to, but this particular group of data refers to any information that is not the content of communications itself, but refers to or is about the communication. This is including the stuff that's being referred to as metadata, and it should be noted that the current law nor the proposed law attempts to define the term metadata, but it doesn't use it in any clause of the law either. Now, this telecommunications data, at present it can contain as much as IP addresses that information has been sent between, or phone numbers that information has been sent between, and in the case of IP addresses, this is essentially enough, if fully recorded, to identify your entire browsing history and what online services you've been using. This group of data also includes your personal account details and other contact details. Telstra currently provides a very detailed set of information as telecommunications data, including, but not limited to your entire browsing history, precise times of communications, locations, and all of your account details. All of this personal information is currently accessible without a warrant. The only requirements for access to this kind of data is that it must be reasonably necessary for the enforcement of criminal law, or law incurring a pecuniary penalty such as a fine or the protection of public revenue. Now, this may sound like a broad range of reasons for your data to be accessed, but you can rest assured that this privilege is being used responsibly by a very restricted range of enforcement agencies. Agencies such as the Australian Tax Office, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Passport Office, Racing New South Wales, Wyndham City Council, and the RSPCA, because although they may just be a city council, Wyndham needs to know your browsing history to enact justice, just like the big boys at ASIO. And do these agencies in this questionable collection use their access respectfully? Well, between 2010 and 2011, this expansive group made over 250,000 requests for telecommunications data. That's more than one request for every 100 people in the country, so you probably know someone who had their personal data requested. So, at what point in time did someone with the Australian Parliament become aware of the world beyond Canberra and see this situation that can quite clearly be improved? Under the previous Parliament, it seems, the one led by the Labour Party, who at the time were led by Julia Gillard. In this Parliament, a request was made from the Attorney General's Department to look into some possible changes. The Attorney General at the time was Nicola Roxon, who asked about 44 potential changes to the current laws regarding the interception and access of telecommunications data. The request was made to the Parliamentary Joint Committee of Intelligence and Security. They were requested to provide their view on, and I quote, applying tailored data retention periods for up to 2 years for parts of a dataset, with specific timeframes taking into account agency priorities and privacy and cost impacts. And this, quote, was buried in a document that also regarded the other 43 potential changes, and was attributed no more explanation than what I have quoted, and yet it was the most controversial topic listed in the entire document. The inquiry that ensued lasted almost a year and included the PCJIS having to manually extract details on the proposed data retention scheme from the Attorney General's Department. And the resulting report on the inquiry is an interesting read, and it identified a few issues with the current law. The warrants I mentioned earlier, the ones for access to stored communications content, the threshold for accessing those warrants was, according to a number of national agencies, complicated and outdated. And then there was the reporting on the use of any telecommunications data, the reports formed by agencies who used it. The reports weren't required to, and as it turned out, weren't very useful for assisting in determining whether or not access to the data had been reasonable or had helped the investigation. In summary, what we have now is a system where just about any of your communications are recorded by service providers, including your ISP, your home phone company, and the online providers you use each day. The content of communication is provided to a number of agencies for investigating serious law, if they can manage to figure out whether or not they're entitled to a warrant through means of a complicated and outdated threshold test. The rest of the data, which is currently enough to probably build a detailed profile on you and your habits, is available to ASIO and city councils alike, so long as they can vaguely justify the use. And when any information does get used, we have no means of determining whether or not it was reasonable or if it really helped at all. And if all that makes you feel safe, then you probably don't understand the gravity of the situation. In light of all of this, the report from the Joint Committee provides 43 separate recommendations regarding the 44 issues originally identified, including the reforms to agency access and data retention. They also noted that they would need to assess drafted legislation before being able to make any definite and final recommendations. This report was released not long after the Labour Party changed hands to Kevin Rudd in 2013, and by this point a new Attorney General had also been appointed. But the report went relatively unnoticed. It was not until more than a year later, when the bill was presented to the Parliament House in the House of Representatives by the Communications Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, that the report received any form of adequate response. After this bill was released, a final report was arranged by the committee, noting that the bill essentially entirely enacted all recommendations made, but required a few refinements to be made to the bill. And it was not until very recently that the final amendments were made, and it passed through the House of Representatives with only 3 votes against. With this recent change, it looks like the bill is picking up pace and will receive royal assent within weeks. In fact, it may even be passed by the time you hear this podcast. So, in light of the knowledge of just how badly managed and how little accountability this current system requires, it may be worth trying to understand just what changes this bill will make. Will it reduce the number of agencies able to access communications data? Will it restrict the data recorded and accessed by agencies? Will the data be harder to access? And what about journalists and their sources? If you want to find out just what this bill does entail, stay subscribed to Tie Demon Beta. Over the course of the next few podcasts, we'll explain just how this will reform telecommunications laws in Australia. If you're enjoying this podcast, or you feel you learnt something new from it, don't be afraid to give it a like or dislike on YouTube to reflect how you feel. More importantly, if you think people should know more about these details, share this podcast with your friends. Tweet it out, put it up on Facebook, post it on a news site, whatever. If you think people ought to know, then let them know. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or in iTunes.